Insurance isn't one size fits all, and shopping for it shouldn't feel like squeezing into something that just doesn't fit. That's why drivers have enjoyed Progressive's Name Your Price tool for years. With the Name Your Price tool, you tell them what you want to pay, and they show you options that fit your budget. Enough hunting for discounts, trying to calculate rates, and tinkering with coverages. Maybe you're picking out your very first policy, or maybe you're just looking for something that works better for you and your family. Either way, they make it simple to see your options. No guesswork, no surprises. Ready to see how easy and fun shopping for car insurance can be? Visit Progressive.com and give the Name Your Price tool a try. Take the stress out of shopping and find coverage that fits your life, on your terms. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Hey there, Duke fans. Welcome to episode 826 of the Duke Basketball Roundup. It is Tuesday, June 2nd, 2026. Happy Pride Month. Happy June. For me, happy World Cup month. And at least for today, happy acquisition of multiple people on the bench and in the front office for the Duke men's basketball team. I'm Donald. I'm your host for this episode. Jason Evans, as he mentioned on the last episode, is on vacation. So in his place, but in always in our hearts, we have Scott Rich. Scott Rich, welcome back. Good to see you.
As I've said before, you and Jason seem to have the most exciting Junes going on between Jason's vacation, between you gallivanting around for the World Cup. It's going to be a very different month for me sitting at home watching Quinn get older and bigger. That's my big June excursion for anyone who was curious.
Well, in the sake of Quinn, have you introduced her to soccer yet? There's going to be a lot of it on this month.
Oh,
So.
she's running around and kicking balls. She was 10 months, 11 months. She's up and about and running around and giving us, heart attacks, running into things, falling down. So I may be coming to you, Donald, asking you about, how does youth soccer work?
Well, look, there is a Women's World Cup next summer in Brazil. I'm planning to go to that as well, and Quinn one day can play in it, and I will
There
be
we
there.
go.
So that's our soccer talk for the evening. Come back soon. We'll have more as I get ready for the biggest sporting event that the world has ever seen. But let's talk about why we're here. We're here for Duke basketball and a couple of hires that just became official this morning. Actually, we're going to talk about the first one, and then we'll talk about another one on the other side of the break. But let's talk about who's going to be sitting on the bench alongside John Shire, and that is KJ Conklin. Jason had mentioned this at the end of the last show that there was some rumor mills churning about KJ eventually coming to Duke as an assistant coach and has now been made official. He most recently was an assistant coach and director of player personnel for the Austin Spurs of the NBA G League. He also has worked at the University of Texas as director of player development. He was an assistant coach at Independence Community College and Olney Community College, as well as a graduate assistant at Louisiana Tech. He's an Illinois State grad. He was a student manager on their men's basketball program. And you're probably thinking, I just mentioned a lot of schools that aren't Duke. How is there a connection here? Well, he has a slight connection to Duke. In 2018, 2019, just after graduating college, if memory serves, he worked as an intern for a place called Pure Sweat Basketball in LA. And they kind of have a lot of high price clientele come in for various workouts. He assisted with player development workouts for several NBA players, but most notably Jason Tatum and RJ Barrett. So he has at least connections to two members of the Brotherhood. And also, Scott, as I bring you in, it feels like once again, we're tapping into the NBA development ranks to try and at least continue this progression of having some guys with coaching experience, having some guys with college experience, and then also the guys who are hoping to prepare some of our players for the next level.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we should underemphasize how unique of a CV this young man has, going from, no real basketball experience beyond the basketball student assistant to literally grinding it out at the community college level before getting a job in the NBA. Like, holy crap, if you want a guy who's going to put his nose to the grindstone and earn his role, that's what this guy seems to be. And it also seems to be a as close as possible to an Evan Brad's replacement, right? What Evan Brad's was a guy who brought the development side at the NBA level to Duke. That is what John Shire seems to be doing again with this hire. It seems to be a trend that when we lose a Brotherhood assistant coach, we bring in another Brotherhood guy. When we bring in one of these outside voices, we like to replace him with another outside voice, which I think is a great thing. I think it's a unique thing that Shire has done to differentiate himself from Coach K. He really does value these external voices and these up and coming voices, right? It takes some guts to go and hire a guy out of the G League to come be an assistant coach at Duke University. But we've seen that those type of moves pay dividends for John Shire, as recently as this past year with the impact Evan Brad's had on this program. And he wouldn't have been he wouldn't be the head coach at Belmont right now if other people didn't see that and say, oh, that guy knows what he's doing. So you give John Shire a bunch of credit for thinking outside the box, both in this hire and also in the other one we're going to talk about after the break, and for bringing in diverse perspectives to his locker room, to his bench, that maybe are going to look at things differently than he normally does, look at things differently than a guy who came up in the Coach K coaching tree. I think this is a great thing to have, and it's a great addition to the staff.
I think it's interesting that he had to scour the earth to find a coach with, as you mentioned, a very diverse resume who is somehow younger than him. Because John Shire is not old. And to find someone who's younger than him with kind of the experience that leads him to believe that, hey, this guy is well on his way, is very, very cool. And like you mentioned, I think the most the thing that has separated John Shire from Coach K so far in his early career is those outside voices that he's bringing in. He's not just relying on the Brotherhood, and for no disrespect to it, he's not treating it like a silo, right? He's not treated like an echo chamber of just Duke voices. He wants people to come in and bring new ideas, fresh tactics, kind of modernization of how the game is being done at the next level. Because as we've said more than one time on the show, every guy on this roster has a dream of playing at the next level, and that dream is attainable because they are at Duke and because they are getting this instruction from guys who have seen the NBA, who have coached in the NBA, who have coached at the G League level, and says this is what you need to be doing because that's what NBA guys are doing in their practice. This is their approach. This is their mentality, and so it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? You have John Shire, who wants to win. He wants to win national championships, and he wants to get these guys a couple steps further than he has over the past couple of years. And he's assembling a roster to do that. And then there's also I know that these guys want to go to the NBA, and I'm going to make sure that not only are they treating this not as a stop on their way, but as a path in their journey where they can develop the tools that they are going to use at the next level. And he's preparing them so that when these guys eventually do go to the NBA, at whatever time they do, they're ready and they know what to expect. And it's kind of like high school, right? Like high school in theory is supposed to prepare you for college. College is in theory supposed to prepare you for the real world. This is that journey. And so I like that they're bringing in these outside perspectives and guys who have done it on multiple levels. And honestly, even at the smaller level, right? When you're talking about the community college level with guys who are literally just all their whole goal is to try and find a way to get out of there, right? And to go somewhere else where they can shine. And so to have that kind of grit and determination, I really, really like and adding him to the staff.
The last thought I have on this hire is I think picking people outside of the Brotherhood is the hard path in this. I think we need to give John Shire a bit of credit for making the hard hires and, evaluating these guys and finding these guys, who maybe aren't on a lot of radars to do this. It's easier to just say, hey, who's the next biggest, Duke alum who's done with their professional career? Let's throw them on the end of the bench. And that's a way that programs can get stale. Duke was lucky in a lot of senses that we hit so many, home runs with those guys on the end of the bench with Coach K. But there are a lot of other examples of programs that do that sort of faltered because of that, right? Michigan football was in a bit of a rut for a while because they were so intent on only hiring Michigan men
Michigan men. Yep.
that arguably you could say that's what derailed the program and led to the last 2 years and all of the chaos that happened in the Michigan football program. You could talk about how down the road at North Carolina, the insistence on only hiring people, from within the family has led to problems. And obviously they've taken a hard right turn by hiring Mike Malone this offseason. But again, every time you think that there is a potential pitfall, John Shire seems to always see that before you see it and have his redundancy, have his shift already in place. I think that's something that he recognized with the need to start hiring people outside the family. That obviously started with Jay Lucas. That's something that he did when he hired Rachel Baker as his GM before anyone else had a GM. And as we'll talk about it a little bit, he may be doing it again with some of the other hires to the larger Duke basketball staff that were announced.
Something tells me that Jim Harbaugh and Sharon Moore would not be leading laps at the Detroit Grand Prix like Kyle Whittingham did this past weekend. But no, I think, yeah, to close out the idea, right, that he, in a way, is kind of trying to remain ahead of the game. Now that everybody has a GM, now that everybody has an analytics guy, and now that everybody has a director of player personnel, how does he keep things fresh? And I think he's also, in a way, again, at age, 39, he has started his own coaching tree. We've had guys leave the last couple of years because of what they're doing at Duke and how guys are responding to some of the things that they're teaching. And that's why he wants Duke to remain not just the premier program, but he wants it to still remain a destination for coaches as well. And so I'd love to, we got a chance to speak with him last summer about how the coaching staff has improved, and I want to know what's churning in their minds as they again try to stay relevant. What trends are they trying to get ahead of? Because as we know, whenever there's a trend, Duke has already probably started it, or at least is first out of the blocks with it. So congratulations to KJ Conklin. We're looking forward to seeing him on the sidelines or on the bench next year and beyond. Let's take a quick break. On the other side, we're going to talk about further front office, if you will, hires, and we're gonna get to talk to Scott a little bit about what his favorite top 5 Duke fans will be, and another tribute that we will close out with as we continue on the Duke basketball roundup. All right, we are back. We shift our attention not with outside the program, but within the program. We're leaving the bench though, and we're kind of talking about the things that go on behind the scenes. And the interesting thing is, we talked about trends, and we talked about what Duke likes to do to kind of be trendsetters and trailblazers. Well, they have established a brand new position. They have a newly established executive director of basketball for Duke men's basketball, and they have made their first hire. The first hire, his name is Alexander Powell. Alexander Powell most recently was director of basketball innovation with the Portland Trail Blazers. He led their team's research and development department, overseeing analytics and software initiatives to support coaching, scouting, player evaluation, and strategic planning. One big focus that he had was on salary cap management, player evaluation modeling, and roster construction. So, Scott, as I bring you in, you mentioned him and Rachel Baker, and again, some of the things that Rachel Baker has done is nothing short of incredible. But now we have this new role here with Alexander Powell, with 8 years of experience in the NBA and all these. He before that with the Charlotte Hornets, he was the head of quantitative analysis and development. Those are words that I have not used in this podcast in a very long time. Quantitative, I've said it 2 times now. But I think, again, forming this new position, it seems like they're seeing what the future holds, and they're saying we need to get better in some of these different areas, namely the one thing that stood out to me, salary cap management.
Yeah, well, you don't say quantitative very often in your day-to-day life. That's a word
3.
I say.
That's
I
3,
say
yeah.
5 times a day in my world. So this was a guy after my own heart, a math major who was also playing basketball, who then turned that into a data science master's from Northwestern, all the while doing these basketball analytics. maybe we'll have him on the show and we'll geek out on math for about an hour and people can just skip that episode. But I
There
think
was no math on this episode. We'll warn you, ladies and gentlemen, ahead of time if there is.
if we ever dive into the mathematics, we will have a big trigger warning
Get your
before
TI
the
89s
episode
ready.
begins. But no, the salary cap thing was what caught my eye as well. And I think that what this hire shows is that John Shire thinks that the era of unlimited NIL spending is eventually going to end. We don't know what form that will take. We don't know if that will be some sort of organized salary cap or that will be people realizing, hey, we can't spend $7 million on Milan Momcilovic every year. There actually has to be, a limit to our fundraising. And John Shire saying, hey, let's get ahead of that. Let's have a guy on staff. Let's have the best guy on staff who can make the decisions, do the analytics, figure out is X player worth Y amount of money, and have that on staff now before that becomes a problem rather than after the fact. I have to imagine it's that forward thinking type of analysis that was going on in John's head here. And again, we talked all offseason about how Duke really wasn't getting into all that many bidding wars, right? As much as Duke fans might have wanted Duke to go out and make, huge offers and go after Milan Momcilovic just because he's the big shiny toy. Duke didn't seem to want to do that, right? If it became a bidding war, Duke said, hey, we know what you're worth. If someone's going to pay you more and you want to chase the bag, go right ahead. So Duke was already, by all accounts, operating in this fashion. This seems to be a way of cementing that, making that more quantitative, to add that word one more time,
Four.
and ensure that Duke is ready to adjust to whatever a salary cap, an NIL limit, etc., whatever form that takes over the next, 3, 4, 5 years. Duke's going to be ahead of the curve with this hire.
I think to even go further, it's almost like they're doubling down on what they're already doing in a way, right? But also, again, not necessarily preparing for the future, but in the role that they have as sort of the trailblazers and trendsetters, they're like, we're going to start this on our own. And we've heard some talk about guys that we've pursued in the transfer portal, guys that we've pursued from high school as recruiting that have come with dollar numbers that Duke has just said, hey, we're just not going to do that. We're not going to get into a bidding war for every single guy that we want. And there's certain numbers that we think are fair for these guys compared to what we're already, paying out for other guys on the team. And if the guy goes over that limit, we're done, right? We're not going to push. Let's get a few more dollars here. Let's get a few more dollars there, because that's how spending gets out of control. They've been very structured and methodical in their approach to NIL numbers, and they have the method to their madness, right? And when Rachel Baker makes the presentation, I'm sure there's a lot of thought that goes through that for every single player. But now it feels like with bringing on Powell, there's a structure of, hey, before we even get to a salary cap, whatever form that may take, let's figure out how to make this ready so that when they do come in, we don't have to create it. We just have to adapt to what we already have. And again, I think they're using those numbers. I think they're using the analysis and the analytics and the statistics to kind of make this work. And I think that's why we have what feels like every year so far a team that is pretty harmonious with regards to nobody's saying, oh, this guy's making way more than me. And you don't hear about a lot of bickering back and forth between the guys about who's making what, because I think it's very harmonious. And again, the structured approach is making where everybody feels like their value is covered. And I think that's the important thing. And that's what makes guys want to come to Duke in a way. And sure, there's going to be some guys who try to test that envelope, and Duke has said no to a lot of those guys. And that's why we see them go elsewhere. And that's why we see them make other decisions. But I think this is all just adding to what they're already doing. And again, trying to stay ahead of the curve.
The last thing I'll say on this is I think there are a lot of current students at Duke who are math majors, who are stats majors, who are computer science majors, who are seeing this news and being like, hey, is there an internship available? Can I come in and can I start
Hmm.
throwing some math at the wall in the math in the Duke basketball department? Something tells me that we are going to be leveraging the incredible student body at Duke to help with all of this new analytics that is going to be going on behind the scenes, driven by AP.
Look, I'm going to give Alexander Powell grace in his first season, but year two, he's probably going to have a sports management course um, on something quantitative. That's five times we've said quantitative on this episode. But I think that is in line with, again, tapping into some of the bright minds that Duke has to create the next scouts, the next analytics departments heads, right? Like that's now a thing that, I mean, even when we were in school, wasn't a thing to consider as a future. Now that it is a future, we're probably even ahead of the game in creating those monsters that are going to be able to, shape what basketball and other sports look like for years to come. So again, congratulations to Alexander Powell. Congratulations to John Shire and the rest of the coaching staff for once again what feels like two home run hires in Alexander Powell and KJ Conklin. Let's move on because Scott, as you are well aware, and our listeners as well, I believe it was a couple episodes ago, or our last episode, we did a little game where we picked our five favorite players of all time, but we did it structured as a starting five. And so you didn't get a chance to partake in that. So while you're here, I'm going to ask you who would your starting five be of favorite Duke players? And just to remind folks, it doesn't have to be the best five that you've ever seen. It just has to be the five that you feel that you could watch them play over and over and over again in college because when you saw them play, it was an event and you just loved watching those guys play. So who are your five?
And I will say, as I thought about this after listening to you and Jason talk about this, I leaned heavily into the favorite element of the component. This is by no means the best Duke team, but it's my favorite team. It's also going to lean a bit more modern because I am the young buck on the DBR Troika, if you will. I was class of 2012. So as much as I'd like to remember Jay Williams and remember Shane Battier, that was little boy Scott that was watching those games. So my favorite point guard of all time is going to be one of my left field choices. It's going to be Tyler Thornton.
Ooh,
I
okay.
loved watching Tyler Thornton play basketball because, in a way, in my head, if Scott Rich was actually good at basketball, he would have been Tyler Thornton. I loved watching hard-nosed, defensive-minded, pass-first point guards play and have them impact winning. And that's what Tyler Thornton did. He was borderline 3, 4 star guy coming into campus. He was not a guy who everyone thought was, really going to be ever more than the bench piece, but he willed his way onto the floor. And then, of course, he was, low key part of some of the biggest plays in, the 2010s of Duke basketball. His shot against Kansas in the Maui
Ooh.
Invitational was one of the great Hail Mary shots that went in. The comeback against UNC, the Austin Rivers shot, does not happen without Tyler Thornton being part of that game. Again, by no means the best point guard on any list of Duke basketball guys, but one of the guys that I love to watch playing so much, and I'm so glad he's on the coaching staff just because of that X factor he always brought.
And I will say for Tyler Thornton, if there's an all vibes team from like the 21st century, him and Josh Hairston together are on it because whenever those two guys would be on the floor, whether it be from warm-ups to starting lineup announcements, those guys always brought energy. And they always, for some reason, they'd come out and do something together where everybody in camera would just be like, all right, well, this I don't know who this other team is we're playing, but they're dead. Like we're getting them because they always had everybody ready to go. So great choice.
And you got to say that duo, that class of Tyler Thornton and Josh Harrison, may be the most successful Duke recruiting class outside of NBA activity. The fact that
Hmm.
Josh Harrison is such a successful agent now, the fact that Tyler Thornton is back on the bench with Duke. Again, we love our NBA guys. We love our guys succeeding on the biggest stage, but it's also fun when those guys that you came up with, that you were there in school with, succeed in whatever they're doing in the world of basketball. So my shooting guard is a little bit more of a classic take. It's a guy that I was a little bit surprised you guys didn't talk more about, and that's Nolan Smith. Nolan Smith is, yes, I'm fudging a little bit. He was point guard, he was shooting guard, but he was certainly the shooting guard on the 2010 national championships. We all know John Shire was the point guard of that team. Nolan Smith should arguably, not arguably, is on the all vibes team, any all vibes team of Duke
Hmm.
players you ever put together. And one of my indelible memories of my time on campus was the comeback that he led at home against North Carolina. The second half, that was basically Nolan Smith, willing that Duke team back from a huge halftime deficit against UNC. That was probably, that was one of the greatest performances I saw in person. I was also there. I was actually on press row when Nolan Smith spearheaded a comeback at home against NC State that I believe at the time was Coach K's largest halftime comeback. We were down by something like 20 at half. And again,
Was that the green shirts game?
the Granger. I don't think so.
Okay, that was an NC State game where they gave out some environmental shirts and the crazies
Oh,
were wearing
yes.
the green shirts, and then at halftime they threw them all, they all took them off and threw them on the floor, and then we came back and won. And we're like, oh, no more green shirts.
Yes, yep, I think you're right. But again, Nolan Smith was a guy who gave me so many great memories when my time in, the Cameron Crazies, from my time on the bench, or covering the team, on press row, and just such a great representative of what it meant to be a Duke basketball player. The fact that he struggled a little bit to find his footing his freshman year, found himself his sophomore year, had to pivot to a new role his junior year, and obviously pivoted fantastically, spearheading that national championship team. And then his role changed again his senior year when Kyrie Irving went down, right? He was not supposed to be the point guard of that team. He was supposed to be in that same shooting guard role. And even with Kyrie Irving down, Duke still went on and get a number one seed in the NCAA tournament. And that wouldn't have happened without Nolan Smith. Uh, my small forward, I had to go classic. I had to follow your lead, and I had to pick Shane Battier. Shane Battier was my entry point into Duke fandom even before I knew I was going to be a Duke Blue Devil, right? Growing up in suburban Detroit, we talked about how I went to, your rival high school. I went to Shane Battier's rival high school. I would turn on Duke games when I was 10, 11 years old because I knew the kid from Detroit, Country Day, was playing for Duke. And that was how I started watching Duke games. That was how I fell in love with watching Jay Williams play. It was because Shane Battier was that entry point. And I just not only loved watching him play at college, but watching the way he represented himself in the NBA as a sort of consummate glue guy, and how he just represented Duke as a community, and has he's done that his entire life post graduation, is one of those things that makes you really proud. Um, One of the things that makes me proud that he's from our hometown, right? Our
Hmm.
home area. There's lots of
Yeah.
if you say hometown in Detroit, you're not actually from Detroit. You anger people. I've made that mistake before. Uh, it's also worth noting that it was fated in the stars for me to be a Duke fan. I was lucky enough to be at a basketball camp when I was 6 years old that was hosted by Shane Battier and Grant Hill, when Shane Battier was the star at DCD and Grant Hill was at the Pistons. And I got a signed shirt with Shane Battier and Grant Hill that my parents somehow kept. And all of a sudden, when I ended up getting my Duke acceptance letter, we pulled that thing out and we said, "Oh, this was fated from, the time you were 6 years old, Scott." So Shane Battier always holds a special place in my heart for that reason. And obviously, is Detroit, Michigan guys. I think, Shane Battier is going to be on any list of Duke players that we'll ever put together.
He's what like I said, he's the best college basketball player that ever played, and uh, people are going to say, "Oh, well, it's this person." You're free to be wrong, in your assessment, but I know the right answer, and that's why I said it on this show.
My four is, and this is again another positional, question mark, but for me, the four is Zion Williamson.
Hmm.
I was lucky enough that they happened to do that Canada basketball tour with RJ Barrett. That was right after, it was literally the year that I had moved to Canada in 2018 to begin my postdoctoral research. And I was like, holy crap, It's again, it's written in the stars. We just moved to Toronto, and Duke is coming to Toronto. We went to both of those games, and if you never got the chance to watch Zion Williamson in person, you've never fully appreciated his magnificence.
Yeah.
There were things that he did that don't fully translate through a television screen. Because when you watch him in person, you go, a man that size should not be able to move as swiftly and elegantly as he does. A man that size should not be able to be that dexterous with the ball. And yes, when I watched him, they were playing against, McGill and University of Toronto, guys that, it's not a fair matchup by any stretch. But just watching him even against scrubs, every possession, I was like, wow, that is special. That is something that no other human being can do with a basketball in his hands. And I will, again, always love Zion because of that experience I had. That team was just such a joy to watch. And obviously, just like so many of our great teams, it didn't end the way we wanted it to. But that year was just so much fun because of what Zion brought to the floor and just because he was a experience in and of himself. You watched games to see what Zion would do, just as much as you watched those games to see how Duke would do. I'm not sure there's
Hmm.
any player in Duke history that you could say that for, that they were, the event more than Duke the brand, more than Duke the game.
And in a way, right? Like the way you said that, people could say, well, that's weird, right? Like that's like it feels like a superficial slash like arrogant type of thing, right? You're watching one guy as opposed to the team. But the reason why you watch the one guy is because the one guy helped the team, right? It wasn't like he was getting his and we're like, okay, now we have to watch the Zion show and we have to watch the other four guys try to play Duke basketball. What he was doing was so exciting and dynamic, and it was also within the flow of the game. And there was never where I said, "Oh, if Zion didn't do that, we would have won." Right? Like maybe hit a free throw, but like there was never a time where I was like, "Man, I wish he did go for that dunk where he dunked for, tried to grab the ball from 13 feet and dunk it because we would have won the game if he had just made the simple pass." Right? He did everything within the flow of the game, and that's what made him even more exciting because when you look at the stats of that team, RJ Barrett is going to go down as a guy who we appreciate as Duke fans, but people are going to largely forget about how great he was in college because everyone
Because
turned on the TV and you saw Zion flying through the air over somebody to dunk a ball. So, yeah, he's the most exciting player I've ever seen in basketball. It was that year, just bottle that year. I watched it over and over.
And I think the thing that we often forget when we talk about Zion, in part because of the way his NBA career has gone, is that Zion played his butt off every
Oh,
time
yeah.
he was on the floor in a Duke uniform, right? The one of the plays that epitomizes him is that final basket against UNC in the ACC tournament, where it was literally Zion Williamson bullying his way in, saying, "Oh crap, I missed. That ball is mine. You're not getting it over me." And yes, it helps when you're 6'10 and built like a tank and can jump through the
Hmm.
roof, but you still have to have that effort, right? He gave that every play in a Duke uniform. You saw that joy. You saw that, infectious energy that he had. I often think, it's been reported, right, that he really thought about coming back to Duke for a second year. And Coach Casewar said, no, you're going to be a number one pick. Maybe not. Given everything that happened, you almost wonder maybe Zion was that guy who needed that extra year at Duke to mature, to come into his own, to deal with the spotlight. Again, that's an alternative history, but it's one of those things that one of those what if questions that lingers in the back of my mind too often. So, my center is going to be a surprise pick for anyone who doesn't know me. If you know me, this will be very obvious. My favorite center of all time is Brian Zubak,
Yep.
right?
I knew that's
So,
coming.
if anyone was on campus from 2008 to 2012 when I was, and you read the Duke Chronicle, you might recall there was some really annoying twerp who wrote a lot of articles in the sports section about Brian Zubek and how Brian Zubek was due for an emergence. And, Duke's hopes this year hinged on whether Brian Zubek could finally emerge. And that was me. And I can't really explain why I gravitated to Brian Zubek beyond the fact that he was a very, very tall human. I am not a very tall human. And so one of the things that I have always enjoyed about basketball is when very tall humans just go, "You are smaller, I am bigger, I am going to dominate you." There's a very visceral joy to watching that happen. We've almost lost that a little bit in the modern game, the positionless outside basketball. The closest we've seen, was a Zach Edey at Purdue or Ademara in Michigan this most recent year. And I just watched Brian Zubek. I was like, why can't you be that guy, Brian Zubek? You're 7'1", you're built, you're a strong man. Why can't you be that guy? And I can't tell you the joy that it brought me when he was inserted in the starting lineup against Maryland in 2010, fresh off growing that beard and just evolved into his final form. It was such a joy to watch happen in real time. It was so fun because I didn't seem like a crazy person anymore in the halls of the Duke Chronicle, for some reason latching on to Brian Zubek being the key to Duke's success. He was. And I will say that the only time I ever got John Shire to give a canned, pre-processed answer in a post-game interview was after the second round against Cal, when Duke is an NCAA tournament. Duke dominated Cal, and Brian Zubek had a dunk in the waning minutes of the second half of the game, and Duke fans went crazy. And everyone on press row was like, why the heck are Duke fans so happy about the 7'1" guy dunking? That's something that happens a lot, isn't it? And I had to explain to people, no, no, no. That's not the way Brian Zubek plays. This is an event. And I asked John Shire about that in the locker room, and he cracked a smile and he said, "Oh yeah, we all got hyped. We all love that, seeing Brian go crazy." So that was, again, if we're talking about the guys that bring me joy, Brian Zubek, I'm not sure how he would play in the modern game, but I would watch Brian Zubek play 10 times out of 10, just because of the evolution that he had, and also that 4-year evolution that we've lost, that we miss so much. He was the epitome of that. You could argue that Caleb Foster is the heir apparent to that, the guy who was written off, the guy who was put off it to the end of the bench, and then all of a sudden figures it out, puts it together, and comes into his final form as a junior, as a senior. You know, man, if I would love more than anything for Caleb Foster to follow that trajectory. Very different position, obviously, but if
Hmm.
Caleb Foster can fully evolve the way Brian Zubek did as a senior, drive this coming team to a national championship, my God, would that be a great story?
I was going to say, similar to Quinn Cook, similar to Brian Zubik, I hope Caleb Foster has a similar storybook ending in our city that we love so much, of Detroit, Michigan, in April.
I'm
Thank you.
looking for tickets. I'm scouring what little connections I have, Donald. I'm trying to make sure we're in the stands for those games in our home city.
I'll climb. I know where the air vents are. I'll climb in through one of those if I have to get into Ford Field, especially if we're in the Final Four in April. A lot of basketball obviously to be played before that. But thanks for your top five. That's a pretty good one. Recap the top five just very quickly for everybody, as we get out of here.
Tyler Thornton, Nolan Smith, Shane Battier, Zion Williamson, Brian Zubek. My favorite player, by no means the best, because I'm going to lose that argument. I know that. But those are my favorite Duke players at each of those positions, my starting five.
I like that. You mentioned Indot, the people's champ, and I'm like, if we had done like a full roster, Indot Smitty would be on mine. But we only did five because we wanted to.
That's what makes it hard. There have to be
What makes
rules.
it difficult? There have to be rules and there have to be cuts, unfortunately. And but I'm glad you were able to mention those five guys. Before we wrap up, I did want to issue a melancholy tribute here, and a lot of people have heard about the story of Liddy Grantland, who is the daughter of John Grantland. He writes in all the time. He sends us. He sends us headlines after every single game. Does not matter where he is in the world. He has been sending us headlines since we started. In fact, I believe it was him who said we should start the headline kind of thing that we do after both football and basketball games. And we talked about Liddy's fight with metastatic brain cancer and I'm sorry, metastatic breast cancer and her just tireless fight to get rid of it. And there was a point where she had found some treatment that was doing her well, but it's my unfortunate new or duty to report that she graduated from that fight this past weekend. And I don't like to say that her fight ended, but she was able to graduate from it in the past tense, unfortunately. And heartbroken does not begin to describe the feeling Jason and I had when we received that news from John. And we want to send our health, our condolences to John, the rest of his family, friends, and Lydia's colleagues who had the privilege of knowing her so well. What we were privileged to learn was not just what she did for so many different things, and we'll talk about a couple of those in a second, but the fact that we learned about her fight through John and the positivity that she carried with her fight. Cancer sucks, and it's a shit disease. I've lost a close friend to cancer earlier this year. It hits everybody. There's not one person on this planet who isn't affected by it, but it's how you fight it that kind of defines who you are and the legacy that you leave. And the fact that Lydia was able to fight cancer with valiant grace and determination, and also just with the zeal of celebrating life with the same passion that she brought to that fight, it means that her legacy lives on. And I know that she was very active with the Duke Wesley Fellowship, Duke Chapel Board. She was still on that active. She was getting her master's at the University of South Carolina while doing this fight. And I'm just torn up at the fact that cancer has cut that fight short. And unfortunately, that's the world we live in. It's not a fair game sometimes, and sometimes the best people get dealt the worst cards. And I'm sorry that Liddy had to go through that, but I know that at least for me, I believe in a higher being where she is at peace and no longer in pain. So first of all, Scott, I would like to get your words on that. I know you didn't know Liddy and John as well as we did, but your words.
I think the only words that capture this are the coarsest ones, which are fuck cancer. That's something that I
Mm-hmm.
think everyone should say on a daily basis, particularly if you have been impacted by this disease, which everyone, like you said, everyone has or will be in their lives. All I can say is my thoughts are with the Grantland family. This is something that no one should ever have to deal with. And by all accounts, as you said, this was someone who fought the disease with every ounce of their being, which is what you hope which is all you can hope for in that type of situation.
As I mentioned, she was very active with Duke Wesley Fellowship, and the family's encouraging anyone willing to consider a donation to Duke Wesley and Liddy's memory. It's dukewesley.org/Liddy. I will put that in the show notes. So when you're done listening to this, please check the show notes. Also, the article on Duke Basketball Report about this episode as well. But Liddy, our hearts are with you. John, our hearts are with you. And to Liddy's family, friends, and colleagues, we are solemn in our thanks for all that you did to help Liddy through this fight, and for all of you out there who were paying attention to the story. And if you know John, or if you want to send your well wishes to us at dbrpodcast@gmail.com, we'll be sure to get it to John Grantland when the time is right for them, as they are dealing with the most unimaginable pain that they're going through right now. We ended on this episode of Duke Basketball Roundup. We'll be back soon with hopefully better news. And Scott, thank you for that. Jason is out cruising the seas of the Mediterranean. He will be back soon. But when there's any news, we will be back. But until then, I don't think we're going to have the Duke band play this one out, but they're definitely going to take us home.